Hello, everyone, and welcome today to our program featuring author John Tateishi, who will be giving a behind-the-scenes perspective on his most recent book, Redress, the Inside Story of the Successful Campaign for Japanese American Reparations. My name is Melissa Yumi Bailey. I'm Program Development Associate here at the National Japanese American Historical Society, also known as NINJAS for short. So I'd like to thank a few sponsors before we get started with our program today. So I want to give thanks to our sponsors, Marcus Bookstores. Marcus Bookstores is one of the places where you can purchase John's book after our program. I'd also like to thank Grants for the Arts, as well as California Humanities for funding today's program. So a little bit about our featured speaker today. John Tateishi was 2.5 years old at the outbreak of World War II and was forcibly removed along with his family from their home in Los Angeles and sent to Manzanar concentration camp. John's experiences from his childhood behind barbed wire never left him. In 1978, John was appointed chair of the National JCL's Committee for Redress and guided the JCL through a controversial strategy that would ultimately unite a harshly divided community and educate Americans across the country about the wartime treatment of Japanese Americans. In 1981, John resigned from teaching at the San Francisco City College to devote himself full-time to the Redress campaign and served in Washington, D.C. as the JCL's Redress Director, a position he held until 2 years prior to its successful culmination in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. I'm honored today to introduce Mr. John Tateishi, along with NINJA's Executive Director, Rosalind Tunai, who will lead our conversation. John and Rosalind?
I know we go way back with you, I think, recruiting me to be the ED for, and actually it wasn't an ED, it was just a staff person at the National Japanese American Historical Society, and you told me to only stay for maybe 3 years. So I think I'm going on my 30th year as executive director.
Well, so, to put it more candidly, I was working with NINJA at the time as a consultant, and there was a need for a staff person, and so you were the one I decided would be the best person for this organization, because it was just at that point just struggling and starting out. And I said to you, don't stay any more than 3 years. And I really mean that. You know, after 3 years, find something else. And you thought I put a 0 behind that. What, it's been 30 years?
Yeah, it's been about 30 years as executive director. But I've actually
by the way, you've done a great job with the organization.
Oh, thank you. It was really, I mean, I think you and Clifford were really the change agents for the organization, and it was much needed. And, you know, thanks for you to laying the groundwork. You guys had the vision to do those changes, to provide that foundation for me to come in and help out, so to speak. So, but anyway, this is about you. So I wanted to have you sort of introduce yourself. And for those people, we have some teachers with us too. So, but it's really an honest conversation about behind the scenes, you know, the shaping of like the sausage making, so to speak. And it, you know, it's not all pretty too. And so I really appreciate your honesty in the book and just sort of telling it how you saw it. But let's get into it. Like, you came to JCL pretty much like an outsider. I mean, you came, you know, at a meeting one time, you said, and your son Stephen actually was sick that day, and Carol asked you to sort of go attend to the meeting, and you guys were members of the Marin chapter, and lo and behold, you become like co-chair. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, just briefly. I grew up with a Kibe father. He wasn't so much typically anti-JCL as most Kibe were. He was really curious about the organization, why it behaved the way it did. That is, he saw the Nisei and the JCL, and generally Nisei, as kowtowing too much, being too obsequious to white people. And he was just sort of, I don't know, I guess amused, but not very not very enthusiastic about the JCL. So it wasn't so much an anti-JCL family I grew up in as one that was kind of disinterested. Carol's father was very active with the JCL before the war. Um, and so she grew up in a JCL household. And we moved to Marin County after living in England for 3 years. And we didn't realize there was no Japanese community here. And Carol was really in search of a community because our son was 2 years old and she wanted to have other Japanese kids for him to play with. And there was an article in the paper, local paper, saying there was going to be this meeting to form an organization. To me, it had all the smells of JCL. And so she was going to go to the meeting, but Stephen got sick that day. And when children get sick, they don't want their fathers, they want the mothers. So Carol told me I had to go to this meeting. I went to the meeting. I was kind of a devil's advocate, challenging most of the reasons given for starting this chapter. And I kind of spoke up a little too much, critical, and was challenged to be part of a forming group, a steering group. And so I ended up, Carol and I went to the meeting where the chapter was founded. And we were founding members. I ended up as the first vice president, that is president, VP 1 and 2. I was the first VP. Carol was the official delegate. So we became very involved. My interest with the JCL was they were talking about reparations. And that I was really curious about that. And having grown up in a Japanese community, that was something camp and everything that camp implied was always something that I knew was shaping me. So as the JCL moved this issue, they started this thing as a discussion. I was really curious to know what was going on because there was talk in the community, but it was very scattered. Nothing really codified, but it was in the JCL. So even though I was reluctant to be a JCL member, that immediately was the draw to me. And so I got involved locally in the Northern Cal area. And we joined in 1975. Within 3 months, I was offered the chairmanship of the Northern Cal region, JCL region committee. And so I thought, this is a great opportunity to really get involved with it. My father was a kind of person who said, if you're going to sit on the sidelines and complain, you have an obligation to do something more than just monku. Because, as a community, we're really good at monkuing. And so, to me, it was an opportunity. So I stepped in where I could and got involved locally. And then in 78 was asked to run the national program.
Well, let's check back. This is just to give people the sort of political perspective at the time, because we're coming off of post-Watergate, right? The country is trying to get out of the Vietnam War. Things are not looking good in the economic scene with the trade wars sort of building up between the US and Japan. And there's sort of the denouement of like not trusting government. So that's interesting. At the same time, of course, Northern California was a hotbed for progressive ideas in the San Francisco State Strike there and UC Berkeley, and then of course the free speech movement way before that. But that generation was coming of age, so you've sort of fit that demographic. At the same time, JCL at the time was predominantly Nisei, but you had a lot of up and coming Sansei progressives that wanted to participate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, my background, political background, was UC Berkeley during the free speech movement in the mid 60s. And what was happening in the country at the time, two things really kind of dominated the conversation. One was the Vietnam War, which had really hit its apex. I mean, the war was just astounding. It changed American society so much. And then the economics that came from that were also being affected by the trade war between the United States and Japan. It started in the early 70s and continued to grow as Japan's manufacturing industries outshone the American producers. And so first you had camera lens and electronics equipment turn to appliances, and then the automobiles. Once it hit the auto market, Japanese really dominated the American consumer market. So you had all these things going on at the time, and we were on the heels of the civil rights movement. And the movement itself was about Black America, about equality and an awareness of what had happened to Black America. And that's as it should have been. And they had their leaders, they changed the consciousness of American society. But it had nothing to do with any of the other ethnic minorities in the country, and especially nothing with Asians. We were sort of a footnote at best of anything social in this country. When people thought about Asians, they thought about, in San Francisco anyway, about the gang wars. And, it was about Chinatown and the cuisine. But when it came to social issues, people really didn't care. And Japanese Americans at that time were the dominant political Asian group, but we had no traction anywhere. And so when the JSL started pushing this issue, it started in 1970, there was already a discussion in the community, and especially down in Los Angeles, a bunch of young guys, street activists, talking about camp and trying to understand what camp was all about, because they hadn't heard about this from their parents. And so as they started to find out more, their knowledge turned to anger. First at their parents for being cowards and acquiescing, and then towards the government. And that's where reparations started to be part of the discussion. The JSL picked that up in 1970, and it evolved as an issue within the organization. Here in the Bay Area, we were probably the best area in the country to have that conversation in terms of public exposure, because the Bay Area is the most liberal area in the country, and it was where we could go out publicly and talk about this, that is, with mainstream Americans, and understand what was going on socially in terms of how we were being viewed. And I was the chair of the Northern Cal District Redress program, and I used the Northern Cal region basically as a test tube. Went public with this issue locally, and was really astounded to learn that most people, even here in the Bay Area, immediate Bay Area, didn't agree with us. First of all, most didn't even know it happened, had no memory of Japanese Americans were removed and put into prison. I mean, they just didn't know. And those who did know had this view that, well, it was because we were a threat to the safety of the United States. It was for protection. And then there was that government propaganda piece that it was for our protection, to keep us safe from these raging mobs that were out there. And so I realized, this is an issue that only we talked about and only we understood. But as it turned out, quite honestly, Japanese Americans knew little about what happened or why it happened. Clifford Ueda, who was the national president of the JCL, elected in 1978, was very active on the redress issue very early on, and in fact was the chair of the National Reparations Committee for JCL. That's when I got to know him. And he and I had a conversation once when he said to me, you know, John, if you go out and talk to 10 white people, they won't know anything about this. You go out and talk to 10 Japanese Americans about EO 9066, they won't know what you're talking about. I found that pretty hard to believe. And I actually went out onto the mall in San Francisco and talked just at random people I knew, Nisei. I'd say, hey, by the way, what do you think about 9066? Half of the responses were, what are you talking about? What is that? It was, to me, almost shocking, but you know, quite honestly, there was a reason we didn't know. You know, it was really complex. We didn't talk about camp, we didn't think about it, and it became a subject that we kept trying to push into the background, into our past, and didn't want to know. And we certainly didn't understand the manipulation that went on that forced us to leave our homes and put us into those camps. So 9066 was not a well-known number. Today, you talk to almost any Japanese American or any Asian, and you ask them, you know, do you know what EO 9066 was? And they can tell you. But that certainly wasn't true as we started this campaign. It was pretty astounding. But you know, what that really showed us how damaged we were by the experience.
That whole specter of incarceration, but I want to have you talk a little bit about your relationship with, of course, Edison Uno and then Clifford. And, you know, the combination of you, Clifford, and Edison working toward this, you know, agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that and their personalities and how you got along?
Clifford and Edison were a study in contrast. Edison was a very public person. He was also, you know, he's very Japanese. A lot of enryo in Edison. Some people accuse him of always trying to steal the limelight. He was actually embarrassed by being publicly acknowledged or recognized. But he was a person who really believed in principles and was seen within the JCL as a gadfly. He raised a lot of issues that were very uncomfortable, some of which were things like, we need to talk about cooperation and we need to talk about what happened in the camps just to keep the subject alive. He and Ray Okamura, a chemist in Berkeley, who was a very, very probably one of the most progressive thinkers in the JCL. They were the ones who developed this proposition, a resolution in 1970. It was around that time that Clifford got to know, Edison got to know Clifford. And they worked on some issues, the Iva Tagore campaign, the Title II campaign to take the off the code books of the United States, the phrase that allow for the existence of the camps. Anyway, Edison introduced me to Clifford at one point. I got to know Edison first, and one thing about Edison and me is that we talked a lot about strategy. Our thinking was naturally in the area of policy and strategy. Clifford was a man of few words, but loved to study and research. He was sort of an intellectual in that sense. He wasn't an activist in a usual sense of getting out there and pushing issues. He stood up for things he believed in. And he had been studying about the whole camp experience. So he understood probably more than most people, certainly more than I did at that time, what this was all about. They had a relationship. They'd been working together on various issues. I knew about Clifford because I was involved with JCL. I'd gotten involved in 1975, and he was very active in San Francisco. And at one point, Edison introduced me to Clifford, and and I say this in the book. I was a bit wary of Clifford because we had very different kinds of points of view. Clifford, in a lot of ways, was a typical Nisei, believed in hard work and keep your mouth shut and get the job done. Don't complain. Don't ask for anything. That was so much of his mentality. My background comes out of Berkeley, and I was much more, I guess the term is liberal, politically. And we clashed. And were it not the fact that Edison introduced me to Cliff, I don't think we would have ended up working together. But I saw this kind of unique quality about Clifford, about how determined he was to seek out justice, not just for Japanese Americans. His big thing actually was Native Americans. That was something that really drove him crazy. And I was really interested in the kind of person he was, but mainly in what I ended up really admiring about Clifford, his tenaciousness and his commitment to truth. He was like a bulldog, this guy. In some ways hard to work with because he was like that. But at the same time, he was always very generous and very supporting. We formed an alliance. My working on the district level of reparations for the JCL, and Clifford as the national chair. He became the national chair when Edison suddenly passed away in 1976, and Clifford was asked to run the national committee after a hiatus of a few months. And it was at that point that we got really close in talking about the issues about the information, sharing a lot of information. And, as it turned out, it worked out well because I thought in terms of strategy, Clifford thought in terms of information. And so we kind of fed each other a lot of the drive to get something done. Clifford was also very impatient. He didn't like to sit around and talk. He was the person who just wanted to act on what he knew. And
did you think because he was a doctor, he saw things a little bit differently, like a clinician?
That had a lot to do with it. I mean, I think that's what drove his research. He was, at times, it was almost compulsive in his research. He really wanted to have information, and he based everything he did on what he read and what he understood to be fact and truth. And he was very much like a scientist approaching a problem, and he would uncover as much as he could. And then we would talk about the things he was learning. And he shared a lot of information with me. And I have to say that a lot of what I understood about what the government did to us came from Clifford, from a lot of this information, in addition to later the research that I did. But it was a sort of an unusual matching. We never would have been friends had it not been for Edison.
Yeah, going back to his sort of approach to the the issues about the incarceration, he always would tell me that if you have a problem, it festers like a wound. You need to treat it like a wound. You need to be able to heal it. And this underlying specter of the incarceration was like this deep-seated wound. And in order to deal with it, you had to address it and head on. And heal it. And we're still in the healing phase. It may never be healed, but we're still in this healing phase. But how do you think that whole concept worked out in bringing up the whole strategy, like addressing it head on? And I guess we're moving into the whole push for the two-part push for the commission hearing and legislation.
Clifford was atypical of the Nisei. He seemed like a Kibe to me, because one thing is he spoke English with an accent. He lived in Japan for a while, but for all intents and purposes, he was a Nisei, but he had sort of this Kibe mentality, and but for Clifford, it was that we were, as a community, we were like a patient with cancer. There was this thing that gnawed at us, and we both understood that what we needed to do was break the silence. That was the one thing that would hold us back forever. We would never get anywhere without our being able to find a way to get the Nisei to recognize what happened and admit to our failures as well as our victimization by the government, by white society in the wartime years. And he really felt this need to break through. And in that sense, he used the analogy once of, it's like a cancer for us. We need to cut it out. We need to find the tools to operate on that. As we started talking about strategy, and keeping in mind that Edison was no longer with us, so a lot of the strategy had to come from my thinking and my exploration of different things. The idea of a federal commission was proposed to us once through a friend I had at the American Jewish Committee. Clifford and I rejected it, thought it was nonsense. And it wasn't until we went to a meeting with what we call the Big Four, the four members of Congress, Inoue, Matsunaga, Mineta, and Bob Matsui, who was brand new to the Congress. So we're really working with these three others. And we proposed what the JCL's plans were. And it was Danny Noe who suggested we think about this commission idea.
Oh, you proposed, excuse me, you proposed the legislative route first.
Oh yeah,
the Big Four, right?
The purpose of this meeting was, I was having a meeting with my committee. Ray Okamura was on that, and we were talking about, let's do this kind of a bill or do this or that. And Ray said, before we talk about legislation, shouldn't we find out if those guys would support it? Because here you had two Hawaiians, and there was a rumor that they wouldn't support because, they were conservative and all these other things. And it made such sense that it was ridiculous. We hadn't even thought about that. So we asked for a meeting. The purpose of the meeting was for us to go to the four of them and say, here is the JCL's proposal. We had in 1978 at the JCL convention in Salt Lake City, created a guideline for redress, which included a $25,000 figure. So our thing was, we're going to go and talk about our demands for $25,000 plus this trust fund. And we want legislation to be introduced that would support that concept. So we did our presentations. And then in the course of the discussion, Inoue, who had been silent for the first 20 minutes or so, said, have you fellas ever thought about a federal commission? My heart dropped, because when Danny Norris suggests something, it's something you need to consider seriously. And he talked about how this would work, how we could do this as a mechanism to get, first of all, an official report by the Congress, because he said, most of my colleagues think what happened to you guys, you deserved. They would oppose any kind of a money bill. And he says, that, you think it's bad in the Senate, you ought to look at the House. The House is the more difficult proposition. And he said, plus, a commission can get you the kind of publicity there's no way you, the JSL, could afford. And if you do this right, you'll get front page news every time the commission does something. And then he said, and we could do this as a kind of exception, have the commission go around to the community. Let the Nisei testify. Let them tell their stories. And that was, to me, the key. It had to be the Nisei. I knew that, yeah, there were Sanseis who were running a lot of the campaign, but it was really the Nisei who were the key to the success or failure. What really appealed to me was the idea of a public hearing where this commission would go to various cities, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, and hold public hearings where Japanese Americans would be allowed for the first time to talk about their own experience, what happened to them during the war. And that has such a huge appeal. It was like this would drive the whole thing in my mind. And it's actually what happened is when and it's funny because the Nisei really were upset that they were going to be forced to testify, to talk. And I used to get a lot of angry calls, and people would come into the JSL office and say, damn it, you're going to force us to talk and all. I'd always say, look, you don't have to. This is all voluntary. Once the schedule was published in the community, that the hearings would be on these dates in these cities, the clamor to get on the witness list was huge. There were people demanding that they be allowed to testify because they felt their story was so important. And it overwhelmed the commission. In the end, there were over 740 Nisei who testified, or Japanese Americans who testified. And even at that, that was just a fraction of those who wanted to tell their stories. So what the commission did was say that they could write their testimonies. They could present written testimonies and submit those, and every testimony would be read. They got tens of thousands of written testimonies at the commission offices. And they read every single one of them. But it changed the whole nature of the redress campaign, because the decision to go to a commission strategy was hugely controversial. In fact, it was really harshly criticized. And
Why? Because of the possible delay?
yeah,
Or,
and this, the accusation was this is like cooperation. The JSL is taking the easy route out. And, this is to appease Danny Noe, who's not really in favor of all of this. And, but I saw that it was the most important key for our being able to finally get a bill in that would do what we were trying to do, which was compensation. But, it was bigger than just the money. I mean, it was a whole range of things we wanted to accomplish. And the commission would do a lot of that for us. The most important part of that were the testimonies of the Nisei, plus the publicity, the education of the public. That was, to me, critical, because until the public agreed with us or sympathized with our cause, we could never get a money bill through. So as much as, it wasn't just the community that attacked us. The majority of JSL members opposed that decision. But, we felt like this was the only way we're going to do it. This is how we'll do it, no matter what the accusations are. But it was a crapshoot. I mean, I thought, my God, what if the Nisei don't testify? What if they refuse to get out there as they have for 30 years? We're dead. This all comes to nothing, and we will have wasted 2 years. But, as I said, the Nisei came out in droves, and the commission, the way it functioned, it met every goal that we sought. The only thing that didn't hit the mark was the amount of money they recommended, 20,000 versus what the JSL demanded, 25,000.
yeah, let's talk about the whole concept of that annual the value system, because here you get the reaction of some Nisei chomping at the bit to testify, which is amazing. And even Issei, testifying too. I know that we would have kitchen table conversations with grandma or grandpa if they're still alive. Hey, what do you think? Do you want to testify? And, oh, no, we don't air our dirty laundry that way, especially to the
Yeah.
public record. At the same time, it's a value, a Japanese value to, and to hold back, to listen to all, in the room before you even talk, to, put your own sensibilities and ego behind, and, allow others to, for to express themselves. So how do you think that played out in, the testimonies and the commission hearings?
Well, I mean, that was the biggest obstacle we faced in trying to create a campaign. When we would hold these meetings, I mean, within the JCL, there was an understanding of the need for this, because we talked about it in terms of the Constitution, et cetera. But in the community, the majority of the elders opposed redress, opposed even talking about this. And those were all those cultural things you're talking about, all these values of gaman and enyo and all of that. You don't bring your dirty laundry out. We don't complain. And this whole thing about shikatakanai. And so for us, it was antithetical to all of our belief systems to come out publicly, even within the community, and talk about these things and talk about how damaging it was to us. But it was like PTSD when all of this started uncapping, and the Nisei finally started talking. As you listen to their testimonies, what was obvious was how painful this all was. That's the worst experience I've ever gone through in the community, to sit there and listen to these personal testimonies and all the pain and hurt that was there. And, I've said this so many times that it's the only time I've ever seen Nisei men cry in public. And just about every single one of them did. It was difficult. It took a lot of courage for them to do this. On top of which, you have all these cultural inhibitions against doing something like this. Just to even talk about it was antithetical to who we are as culturally, as an ethnic group in this country. And it was having to overcome all of that led to these Nisei and Issei having the courage to get up there. Niseis didn't talk in front of public. That just never happened. And for them to get up there in an auditorium filled with their friends and their community and talk personally about what this was about, what it did to them, and then to break down crying about it, that was really, really difficult. And they knew they were going to break down, because you could, anytime you sat down and you talked with a Nisei who was willing to tell you about what they experienced, they would start to get really emotional and stop. And so, we had this idea that this was the only way we would achieve the final goals of what we were trying to do. All of these broader goals of redressing the wrong, but the constitutional issues, all of that. And then to get to this money issue, this was the only way we could do it. I think in some ways it was lucky for us that it worked as a strategy. It could have been a total failure. And had we not done that, we'd still be fighting to try to get redress. I'm convinced of that.
Do you think the media helped portray a more sympathetic approach to?
Oh yeah. Before the hearings, the most we could get in the media was, what do these people think? I mean, who do they think they are, demanding money when they deserved what they got? They were a threat to us. And so all the editorials we saw early on were really against our effort to have this issue even addressed. And that started to change as we fought this battle in the public arena. But boy, after the hearings, you rarely ever saw any commentator have a negative or oppositional view of what we were demanding. And, you know, and people understood $25,000, that's hardly anything for 3 years. And, you know, it was symbolic. And they understood that. But what they saw was the importance of what we kept almost preaching, that the only reason we're doing this is to prevent it from happening again in the future. That was sort of the battle cry. You know, I would say $25,000 for 3 years, you're kidding me. That's nothing. That's not what this is all about. But the money was important because that's what drew the media's attention. Before that, you know, we were sending out press releases left and right, never got anything in. And at the JCL convention in 1978, we took a position, $25,000. And I talk about in the book how we came to that number. But once I sent out a press release saying, we are demanding $25,000, all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, what do these people think they are? And I mean, across the country, editorials started cropping up, you know, in the big papers like the Times and the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, really critical of what we were doing. The money was what drew the attention to it. And we needed to do that. We needed to fight those negative battles in the public in order to get the public to understand why we were doing it and what this was all about. But, you know, it was a long haul campaign. One of the criticisms of the commission's strategy was that the ISA will be gone before this is even at the point where we can demand money. True, we lost a lot of Nisei or Issei in those 2 years. And we started seeing the Nisei generation start to disappear. But, you know, as I said, had we not gone that route, I'm convinced we never would have been able to pass a money bill. We'd still be fighting for one.
Yeah, that's an excellent strategy. We're coming toward the close, and we have these questions that are coming up in terms of even, reparations today. I think people talking about Black reparations and parallels that we could see in terms of strategies for the future. Melissa, this is our cue. So can we throw in some questions here?
Yeah. So we're gonna just do a brief explanation of how the Q&A works in case any of our audience is not familiar with that. So we are using the chat box in Zoom to do our Q&A. So if you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a bar with different icons. You're gonna want to click on that chat icon and then type your questions into the box that pops up. So I guess we'll go ahead and move now into the questions for John. So we had 2 questions from Elizabeth and Corey that are somewhat similar. So I'm just going to combine those 2. Why was the subject of camp so taboo? Comes from Elizabeth. And then Corey said, like hundreds, if not thousands, I found out in college about the Japanese American incarceration. Can you explain why our parents remain silent about telling their children about the incarceration?
One thing that happened as we came out of the camps was that the Nisei, it wasn't that they would not talk about, they couldn't talk about camp, because if you have a cultural value of honor that guides most of what you do, to have been so dishonored by what the government did to us, keep in mind, we had no say in any of it. We couldn't publicly speak out about this. So what happened was the government forced us from our homes. The newspapers talked about this. It was all over the press that the Japs are being forced to leave, and good riddance. And then we were in these prisons. And so as the war ended and we started returning to our homes, there was this idea in people's minds that we had been traitors. And in time of war, the worst thing you can be is a traitor to your own country. And so we carried that label. People believed that we were in these camps because we were traitors to this country. In addition to which, the fact of having been imprisoned for 3 years is really shameful. And so the Nisei just couldn't talk about what happened and to try to defend the fact that we were there unjustly. There wasn't that mechanism for them. So they turned instead to silence. They would not talk about camp to the point that, and keep in mind, they wouldn't talk to each other. Husbands and wives didn't talk about what happened in those 3 years. It was like it got erased. And it was a kind of psychological defense mechanism, a way of coping with something they otherwise would have a really difficult time coping with. And so they didn't talk about it at home. But the kids talked. Those of us who were kids in those camps, after the war, we talked about it a lot among each other. And I think for us, it was a way to try to sort out what that experience was about and to try to come to some understanding. But the parents could not talk about it. It wasn't that they wouldn't. After a point, they could not talk about it. And so they didn't even tell their kids who were born after the war about this experience. And so these kids grew up and ended up going to college where even in their history classes, it wasn't discussed. And every now and then some professor would say, history professor, would say as kind of a footnote, oh, and by the way, Japanese were put into prisons because they couldn't be trusted. And so this was something that a lot of senseis, young senseis, learned about in their college history classes and would call home and say, what is this all about? Their parents still couldn't talk about it. And it took a lot for them to break that silence. And if they weren't going to talk, the country didn't care because they didn't know.
Can you talk a little bit about the strategy to, the veterans are very critical in this juncture to especially on the Hill, right, to sway some conservative Republicans on this. Can you talk a little bit about, I know you weren't involved too much in the legislation part of it, but can you talk a little bit about that strategy?
Well, we as benign as the commission bill was to get that passed, and it got passed very quickly just because we had key people in key places, but we started having the vets go out and talk to members of Congress. Those who were opposed, but we thought were possible changes. And so we would find vets who had been in certain experiences, go to Washington and meet with these members to talk. And they were always constituents we sent in to talk about what they experienced coming out of these camps, going into the military, the 442 or the MIS, and fighting for this country, having lost everything. And we found one of the most effective tools that we could use. And once the commission bill got passed and the commission finished its work and issued its recommendations, we took those recommendations and turned that into the first money bill, which evolved as 442. And lobbying that was much, much harder than having lobbied the commission, where there was always a lot of resistance. But what I did was when I lobbied the commission, I picked the members who were opposed because I felt like they needed to be broken down because there's this money bill that's going to come. And so once we had a money bill, I was the principal lobbyist, and those were the people I went to visit, the ones who opposed. And I always, if I could, found a Nisei to come to Washington and sit down with this member. And I'll tell you, 90% of the time, they would convince them. They may not like it, but they would vote for it because it seemed the right thing to do, given all the sacrifices and the obvious patriotism of Japanese Americans. The the vets played a key role in a lot of this.
Yeah, that was true for the Congressional Gold Medal as well. I mean, we could bring a vet to an office and they would essentially be the celebrities in the congressperson's office.
We actually have a couple questions related to this topic. So again, I'll just kind of ask both of them together since it's related. So one question which came from Pauline. Why wasn't Senator Inoue in favor of the redress movement? Was it because he felt it wasn't realistic and wouldn't be successful? Yet he suggested forming the federal commission. Ironic. And then another question from Bryn. I live in Hawaii and support preserving the Nisei veteran story. I'd heard that Senators Matsunaga and Inoue were strong lobbyists in support of HR 442 and helped sway members of Congress to pass the bill. Their influence is supported by war records, specifically with members of the Texas delegation, the Rescue of Lost Battalion. Can John speak to this?
Yeah, I'm really glad whoever it is raised that question, because there was this myth mainly in California, that Inoue and Matsunaga were not going to support, that they were really soft, they were too conservative, etc. Dan Inoue was the one person I worked the closest with throughout all of this. And I was quite honestly surprised at how adamant he was about the need to do this. And his suggestion of the commission strategy was simply because he knew he could not get a bill through to demand money. A compensation bill would not have passed the Senate. And his comment to me was, if I can't get a compensation bill through a Senate where I can control a lot of it, think of what Norm Menendez is going to have over in the House. You have no chance in hell. And he didn't know if he could get a compensation bill through. And Sparky was a real worker on this. Inoue was very powerful, very influential. He just by a phone call could get a vote. And his recommendation to go to a commission strategy was to open the door to convince colleagues in the Senate and the House of what happened and to have a record of the injustice. Because up to that point, there was nothing in the record about what happened to us other than the research you could do, and you'd have to put it all together. And so they said, this is the best way to do it if you're serious about being successful. If you want to just, charge the hill and go down in flames in honor, fine, do it, but that's a stupid way to do it. And I know from having worked so closely with Inoue that he was fully committed to this. And he was biting at the bit to get a money bill in there because he wanted to move that in the Senate in order to help Norm and Bob in the House with the opposition they were going to face. And, that strategy worked.
So raising public awareness was key to
everything.
Changing, yeah.
Yeah. From the very beginning, that was the key to all of it.
And another side strategy actually was actually long since you left JCL. I know you came into the National Japanese American Historical Society along with the veterans and Clifford to help create this exhibit at the Smithsonian with the help of Norman Mineta too as well. And then A More Perfect Union came out of that, which really, it was right there in Washington, D.C. People can go see for themselves the objects and the story behind this constitutional crisis, so to speak, during World War II. So that had a play.
That actually was a really important exhibit. Most exhibits at museums were these, like in the corner, this little display. But that took up a lot of space in the American History Museum at the Smithsonian. And a good part of that came from the Ninja collection. That's what spurred this whole effort at the Smithsonian. But, you think about the millions and millions of people who go through the Smithsonian and they saw that exhibit. And most people were really astounded when they saw it.
Initially, was it all about the money? And how many Issei were able to receive reparations? And then one last one, can you speak a little about the Redress Trust Fund? What came of it? How much is in it, and who and how administers it? If you could briefly summarize if that's possible. And then we'll end with 2 more questions on legacy that also go together.
The majority of Japanese Americans who received redress payments, it was $20,000, were Nisei. The numbers just worked in that area because the majority of the people who were in camp and who were still alive were the Nisei. I underestimated. Danny Noah asked me, how many are we talking about? I thought, because we had at JCL had done some studies and we came up with a figure of 60,000. Well, we were 20,000 short. And so there had to be a second bill to augment the authorization. But the majority of the Nisei, or majority of people who got, I don't know the exact numbers, I would guess like 85% who got redress money were Nisei. I'm sorry, what was the second part of that? The money part?
So the first one explained about the money, and then Issei, and then the Redress Trust Fund. What came of it, and how and who administers it?
Is that the Civil Liberties?
Yeah, Civil Liberties Fund. It was called Civil Liberties Fund. Our idea was we would ask for individual payments, $25,000. This is a JCL position, $25,000 per person. And we would decide the eligibility, who would be eligible to get it. Because our feeling was everybody. It didn't matter circumstance. If you were here and alive, you got it. So that was our criterion. And on top of that, we knew there would be a lot of people who would have passed and would not be able to collect the money. So we said a trust fund for those who had experienced it but were no longer alive. And we asked for a $500 million trust fund, which would be a perpetual fund that would provide money for projects and studies, et cetera, related to constitutional issues relative to the internment, and that it would live in perpetuity and would be refunding itself by its interests. The $500 million was what we went in with. It got reduced through a lot of debate to $5 million. That was the final amount. And there was a committee that was established of Japanese Americans. The chair of that committee was Dale Minami. And within a couple of years, the money was gone.
All right, so we're gonna come now to our last 2 questions before closing. Thank you again so much to our audience for participating. So these 2 questions are actually related specifically to legacy and other redress movements that are currently ongoing. So there are many redress movements happening right now, from the Japanese Latin Americans to Nikkei in Brazil, and of course beyond as well with HR 40. What advice do you have for these reparation movements that are continuing their efforts today? And one more question, is there any national group being formed that will bring together the BLM movement, the Japanese Latin Americans, who just won a decision in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and those who participated in the Japanese American redress movement that backed the 1988 redress bill?
You know, I've been in conversations and on some talks, broadcasts on Black reparations. It's obviously it's a very different kind of issue, much more profound, much bigger, much more complex, and it has so many nuanced parts and so many different points of disagreement and conflict. I do think that even though redress for us was a very different animal. It's very defined. You know, it was a constitutional abrogation. The numbers were really clear. We knew exactly how many Japanese Americans, and we knew in the descendancy from those of us who went through it to those who are now 5th, 6th generation. So you could define our experience very clearly. You cannot do that with Black reparations. It's too complex to be able to do that. but there are a lot of conversations about strategy, and where I get called to contribute to some of the thinking is on how Japanese American redress informs some of the thinking about strategy for Black reparations. And some of those proposals are very different from what we went through and how we designed our campaign. But a lot of it is leaning into that direction. What they finally come up with, and there is that bill, HR 40, which seeks a commission. I don't know if that'll pass, but I know there are other proposals. Whatever the final proposal is, I think Japanese Americans can and need to support it and provide whatever understanding we have from our experience to contribute to helping move that issue. I'm absolutely convinced that this will be the major social issue of the 21st century. And until it gets resolved one way or another, it's got to get resolved if we're going to work our way out of this quagmire of racism in this country that that continues to repress and suppress the Black community, and this kind of wealth gap between the wealthy and even the average wealth of white America and the experience of Black America. The gap is so huge that until we start to close that and find some equitable way of addressing that particular issue, this is an issue that's going to stick around for another 400 years. And it's going to be difficult, but I think it's possible. Today, I think it's very different from, well, certainly before the election, but it's very different from before May 25th and the killing of George Floyd. I think people now see a possibility for this kind of an issue. And I hope that future generations of Japanese Americans learn enough about redress and how we did it and why it was so important. Not because we won it or because we got what we wanted, but because it did a lot to change the way Americans think about Japanese Americans and about that experience and whether it's okay to do something like that. That's really important, as the knowledge that comes from Japanese American redress to what Black America is experiencing and what Black reparations is all about.
Thank you
That's
so
great.
much.
That's great. We can go on for another, we might have to do another session because we could probably talk about campaign for justice and Japanese Latin Americans and all this stuff too. But thank you for your insights and honesty. And we need to read that book because I wish I read it 20 years ago because I could have learned a lot.
Well, if I
all
wrote
the mistakes I've made.
If I wrote it 20 years ago, you could have read it.
Thank you very much. For
Yeah,
your
thank you.
time.
I really appreciate you doing this. It's always good to talk with Ninja. You guys have a special part in my heart.
Oh, thank
we
you.
go back a
Thank
long
you.
ways.
Yes, you do. Thank you. Write your second book now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and close up the program. We just have a few announcements though before we end. So just one second. So on sale now, you can purchase John's book, Redress, the Inside Story of the Successful Campaign for Japanese American Reparations, at the Ninja's online store, so ninjas.myshopify.com. We have signed copies available, 10% off for today's attendees. And if you are a Ninja's member, we'll give you an additional 10% off for a total of 20% off. You can also purchase the books at Marcus Books, one of our sponsors, Heyday Books, and Amazon. And please be sure to visit John's website, johntateishi.com, for more info on upcoming events, including a talk with the authors From Here to Equality, a book on Black reparations on February 3rd, 2021. And as you can see, for more information, please visit johntateishi.com. So I want to just thank again our sponsors, as well as the staff working on today's program. Thank you again to Rosalind, our executive director, for hosting along with me and having a conversation with John. Thanks to our staff member, Tim Chen, for registration and outreach, Max Nihei for production. Of course, thank you so much to John for participating in today's conversation. And the musical interlude you heard today, Reflecting Blossoms, was composed by Chanel Mao and directed and sound engineered by Charlene Din and Jessica Ria Yamada. Thank you again to Marcus Books, Grants for the Arts, California Humanities, and the SF Gosso Trust for sponsoring today's program. Thanks so much. Stay safe and have a good holiday.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Max.